Hello and welcome, everyone. Good afternoon to you. My name is Farah Bala. Pronouns are she, her. I am the founder, CEO of FARSIGHT. Welcome to FARSIGHT Friday. This is a podcast of community learning, listening and learning. We are currently in our 4th season. FARSIGHT is a leadership and organizational development consultancy. We prioritize equity, diversity, inclusion, anti-oppression as core leadership competencies in the workplace. This is a very, very important topic, especially given where we've been, how we have survived these last 3 years. May is also Mental Health Awareness Month, and there could be no better time to really dissect this conversation on neurodiversity. And I am so grateful and so excited for this esteemed set of guests that we have here today. Introduce yourself, tell us who you are, what you do, and why you do what you do.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Sarrett. I am in Atlanta, Georgia. My pronouns are she, her, her. As a visual descriptor, I'm a white woman wearing white glasses with long dark hair. I am a former academic. I was a professor at Emory University studying disability and neurodiversity and culture and history and health. And I left to do diversity, equity, and inclusion full time. I do identify as neurodiverse myself or neurodivergent, and I'm excited to have this conversation with these amazing panelists.
I'm Marcia, Brissett-Bailey. I'm an educator. I've been working within education for the last 30 years. I've worked across the sector, so probably I'm based in the UK, and what I should say first and foremost, I am a Black woman. I have a headscarf of African print, and I've got a kind of interesting gown cloth with all sorts of prints on it. So I like colour, I like to be vibrant. And yes, as I said, I've been working in the education sector for the last 30 years, and I've worked across the sector from kindergarten, as we may call it, right through to higher education, probably working mostly with 16 to 19 as a careers advisor. And I'm an author, and I've written the book Black, Brilliant and Dyslexic. Something that was really important to me about representation, which I know we're going to talk about a little bit today. I'm neurodiverse. I'm a she, her as my pronunciations, and I'm really passionate about this subject, being neurodiverse, and always didn't feel that I belonged within the education system in particular. So I really want to sort of divulge into the conversation today when we get started. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tran. I go by pronoun he, him. My background span a variety sector, including healthcare, technology, philanthropy, digital media, and entertainment. I guess I also identify as a neurodivergent, and kind of am like focused. My current work is I've been in the DEIA advocacy space and kind of do storytelling. So I kind of help kind of focus on content creation and media. And I guess I have a very passionate also on authentic media portrayal and focusing on the intersection between API and disability and neurodiversity. And I kind of spend my spare time has been focusing on consulting small businesses and nonprofit and DI spaces, but I also have done media consulting as well, where I kind of work with respectability and organization token on in disability inclusion. And I recently have been certified to be a peer support specialist for a mental health startup, and kind of helping to destigmatize mental health and make it more accessible for people, and to kind of advocate for those who are new to neurodiversity and they don't lack the resources and community, and so I kind of provide that space for them. And yeah, thank you, and glad to be here and just be able to talk about this important issue with y'all.
Hi, I'm Sam Crean. I am the legal director at Quality Trust for Individuals with Disabilities in DC. I am an autistic adult, and I'm the former legal director at the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. I'm really interested in neurodiversity, raising awareness of supports and services, as well as reasonable accommodations available to people who are neurodivergent, and specifically on also making sure that people understand the intersections among different forms of neurodivergence. So a lot of people think neurodiversity is, autism, ADHD. It's also intellectual disability, psychosocial disability, PTSD, traumatic brain injury, lead exposure, so many different things that can result in neurodivergence. And there's a lot of really fruitful areas for people to communicate across different identity groups.
Sam, I want to continue this thread that you're opening up. I want to start with if we could hear from each of you of how do you describe what neurodiversity is in terms of the conditions, but then also how they show up in humans. And one of the reasons I want to start here, if what is this? Can we just explain and define it? Is there is still misconception of what neurodiversity really means. A year or two ago, I had put out a call for resources, specifically on neurodiversity resources. And I can't even begin to tell you the amount of responses I got from people sending me stuff around neuroscience. So we really need to start. Before we get to how do we create more inclusive spaces, we first need to understand what is neurodiversity. So can I ask you to please share with us your perspective on that?
I think we take it right back to the research of Judy Singer, who's coined the term neurodiversity when she was doing her research in autism. And so that was in the 90s, 80s. She's a sociologist and really she was looking at autism and the celebratory motives from my understanding. But what's happened over time, various, whether it's dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, ADHD, and as Sam mentioned, but other learning differences like dyscalculia. I said that already, didn't I? And bipolar and brain injury accidents. These started to overlap within the term neurodiversity. People sort of linked onto that, just like myself being dyslexic. I've joined that kind of neurodiversity and wanting to be that celebratory model that I could identify with and link with. And I did that when I was doing my master's. That's exactly what happened. I found this word neurodiversity through studying about Judy Singer. And there I was feeling that I was part of or belonging to a community really of other people who were neurodiverse. And so that's kind of my little take on it. There's more to it, and sort of that whole biodiversity and, born, this is how I'm designed and how I'm born. So this is kind of my take on it, not even looking at the social model and the medical elements to it, but that's kind of my little snick of looking at neurodiversity and how it was coined through Judy.
Marcia said she came up with the term based off the concept of biodiversity, which we know is the variation of species that we have on this earth that's in delicate balance to make sure that the earth maintains like homeostasis. And so neurodiversity explains all the different ways that human brains express themselves, change, challenge, enable, all kinds of different things. So I think of neurodiversity as really just a term that refers to the diversity of the types of our brains and cognition. And so I include everybody. That includes every single human, right? If you are, but neurodiversity is most often used to refer to people who have some sort of neurological difference. And that can be, like everybody has said, a range of things. And what's also important to keep in mind about neurological difference and neurodiversity is that all of these diagnoses are used in reference to what is quote unquote normal, and that is very social and culturally determined. So the expression of neurodiversity, the expression of autism, the expression of ADHD filters through all these cultural norms and things that we've been taught from birth. And so may look a little bit different depending on where the world you are. So there's a lot of variation within neurodiversity.
Yeah, and adding on to what Jen and Marcia was saying is like how these brain differences encompass like the neurodiversity framework of like how it's like kind of growing up in the US. It's kind of like there's like this certain standard, what's called neurotypical, of how like our brain function a certain way, identify as autism, ADHD, and among others, like neurodivergent traits. Like it's also kind of like this is how I kind of identify myself as, but it's like, but these are kind of like, this is my brain, but then as human, we have many different type of brains. Like some brain are like ADHD and autism, some ADHD are just ADHD or trauma, or there's many variances of that, and it's just like everyone's like belong to a neurodiversity pool of it. But at the same time, it's like how you choose to identify or how you kind of think. It's also kind of how like society is, the stigma, the framework of it, how it shaped us into like thinking like, oh, there's a deficit to our brain, or like because it's not considered the norm, it's considered like a problematic, or we see them as less and not worthy of each other. But at the same time, it's like we're all like just our own way, how the brain impact us are very different, and we have different operation process and that make up who we are.
Yeah, 100%. So, the other thing that we need to keep in mind is, as Marcia mentioned, this is also called the social model of disability. So this is not unique to neurodiversity. This is something that the disability rights movement really focused on even before the neurodiversity movement. But when we understand that brains are sort of, let's imagine brains as neutral, right? A person's brain does the things that it does. And the medical community and the social community will sort of label certain brains as outside the norm, or as defective. And this isn't to say that there aren't real consequences to an individual of how their brain works. So someone with major depression, right, is someone who's experiencing pain from the way that their brain works. People might still want to need accommodations for how their brain works. But at the bottom line, when we talk about the social model of disability, we're in the framework where we're not doctors, we're not trying to cure a person, we're not trying to change how their brain works. We're trying to eliminate barriers that make it difficult for someone with a particular kind of brain to operate in society. And I think depression might even be a good example. So someone with depression might still want to treat their depression medically, but at the same time, when that person shows up for work, they might also need social accommodations, time off in order to manage their health condition. They might need changes in their work schedule because of how medications are affecting them. Maybe it's very, very difficult for this person to be awake in the mornings. They're much more awake in the evenings. They want an alternate work schedule in order to be able to show up for work at a time when they're functioning better than other times. And so we can see this disability, and I consider it a disability, through different kinds of lenses. And in the workplace, we want to talk about that social lens and how we can eliminate barriers to people.
I want to name, I had a neurotypical moment where even as I was describing the topic, I called it a condition. And all of you very kindly reminded me that that is a very ignorant way of naming it, where it is truly a diversity of how the brain functions. So I just want to name that and acknowledge that was not the best way to describe it. I'd like to stay in the space of stigma and othering that neurotypical folk have created for neurodiverse communities. If y'all could touch in even on history, right? Because it for me, it feels like these are the catchphrases of certain times. Right now, it's neurodiversity. Before that, it was mental health. Before that, it was work-life balance. Before that, it was something else. But these structures, these barriers of who is normal, who is not normal, have been systemically created. So I'd love to open that up to talk more about how the stigma shows up and where from your perspectives of lived experience, it might have originated.
We're talking about neurodiversity, but I think where Kimberly Crenshaw comes in with intersectionality, for me, I talk with them hand in hand. So I've got this young Black girl growing up, that's me. And the education system constructs a certain way that told me I wasn't good enough. So already at the very early age, I was being told I wasn't good enough. And not only that, I was told I was not good enough as a young Black girl. And also the role models, what I was seeing, the curriculum I was learning, it didn't look like me. It didn't relate to me. It wasn't telling stories that I could relate to. And then I had my grandmother telling me I had to work hard enough. I had to work twice as hard, shall I say, to be able to show up as myself, be my whole authentic self. So this was very confusing because I wasn't understanding phonics. I couldn't read, but everything around me was telling me, as a Black woman or as a Black young girl, it was negative. So there were so many kind of things. But again, my grandma said, you've got to show up, you've got to just do the best. So authority, conforming, following the rules. How could I say how I was feeling? So I selectively muted. So that's how trauma came in for me. My teachers told my parents I'll never academically achieve. And I always wondered, was it the intersections of my teenager mother? Was they statistically thinking that I'm never going to achieve? Or was it that I couldn't learn the standardized assessments that I was being taught? Because I knew that dyslexia, which is who I am, is not based on intelligence, but yet I was being tested on my memory, which is one of my weak spots. So you're never going to see my strengths. You would never get an accurate assessment of my intelligence by the assessments that's put in. And this is the construct of our society and the way we assess in that linear way, in that rote way. It doesn't work for me, but I know I can show up. I am a disruptor. I like to see the beginning of something to the end, and I have to bring people with me because they don't see the vision of, I've created the house, but the house still needs to have the foundation. I've already developed it. That's the way my brain functions. I'm disruptive, but it enriches and it's good for business if we can work together in harmony to bring it together. We're all neurodiverse, but we're not all marginalized by it. It's something that Atif Chowdhury always mentions, and that's really important and key, and why I advocate the way I do. The last point I say, I remember when I was doing sociology at school, and they had that triangle, and it says that only so many people can reach. That's always stuck in my mind. So it's by design. So how do we unpick those layers? We've got to be in it for the long haul.
Add on to what Marcia was saying about from a cultural lens and of intersectionality, as like an Asian American growing up, like kind of facing there's a lot of stigma and a lot of shame, guilt upon of kind of with disability, and even with mental health, or kind of a lot of comparison too. If you're different, or why aren't you like this other kid, or how are so or why aren't you performing as well as the other kid? What's wrong with you? And I kind of thinking there's always something wrong with me growing up, and kind of bringing that into the academic thing where it's tied to the model minority myth, where kids working hard to get good grades and kind of meeting expectation, and just kind of if you're doing well in school, they wouldn't think there's anything wrong with you, oh, you get good grades and anything like that, but they don't consider social cues or social communication, how you do well with interaction with your peers, or anything like that. And I think those are things that I had trouble with, and I didn't know how to even express my emotion or even be vulnerable. I think it was kind of thing where showing my emotion would consider a weakness and shade upon, and even being around toxic masculinity, where we're kind of you have to show up as being strong and all together at a time, but then we're actually not the case in that way, and it's kind of anything that is less being unconsidered as a deficit, and by no means are we deficit, and it's just kind of we just have functioned differently, and it's just kind of how the system and cultural expectation of us to kind of be one way and kind of follow a certain format. And I think with the modern minority myth, it's kind of pitting us against each other. What's the kind of expected, so the basic traditional stereotype of what we should be like. But then of course we don't actually, we can't deviate from that. And I think it kind of helped form this cultural assumption that we are this way, and people think that we all are all the same, but I think our brain is just very diverse, and we're all just diverse in general. Yes, we have some quality and traits that make us age identify as into that category, but our lived experience are very different by each person and their background.
If we think about who created, the foundational principles and structures and institutions of our world, it was men, largely, middle upper class, mostly white, at least in the global north, which of course with globalization is now, more of a global thing. And so all of these social norms were created from one narrow perspective, white, middle upper class, cisgendered, heteronormative, landowning men. And, women didn't have a perspective, people of color didn't have a perspective, and certainly not people with disabilities. And so that created marginalization, right? That still persists today. What's a little bit different about disability is that disability labels, particularly labels referring to neurodiversity, have been used to further marginalize other groups. So for example, women, when we weren't allowed to vote is because we were thought not competent enough to understand the complexities of politics. Enslaved people who it was justified because people of color were not competent enough to manage their own lives. Indigenous populations, if you had a 16th or more of indigenous blood, you weren't able to own land in America because you were not competent enough to manage it. Things like that. Disability stigma is used, it kind of, I think, is particularly difficult to address because of that historic connection of like, oh, but we're not like that, right? Women, we are smarter than that. We're not incompetent, right? But then there's still this, category of people who are neurodiverse. Some, the old word might be incompetent, things like that are, we exist and are like, what about us? So disability is kind of seen as a natural way to rate people or categorize people. And so that natural, so the stigma associated with it is assumed to be natural, but it's not. It is entirely man-made, which is good news because that means it can be reversed, right? It can be unmade.
With disabilities, a lot of the time, and it's good to see patterns in the stigma, I think is the other thing. Does stigma, different people have different kinds of stigma. Does stigma mean you're actually a bad person? A lot of people who are neurodivergent are stigmatized as violent, as less capable, as sort of unpredictable and scary, as irresponsible, lazy. It's always good to hear like what those messages are and see how they intersect with each other, because frequently it's connected to other intersecting stigmas, like what Marcia was saying, right? You've got someone who's, seen as less capable because she's dyslexic and because she's got a single mom and because she's a person of color. And, someone else who has dyslexia might be perceived in a completely different way because of different intersectional identities.
I'm so appreciative that y'all have named up front that all of the neurodivergence and the othering and stigma is rooted in trauma and is rooted in separating who succeeds and who doesn't. And Jennifer, thank you for stating who created those silos as well, right? So if we go under that framework, what myths would you like to clear up in terms of, Sam, you were talking about all of these labels that a neurotypical perspective would put on neurodiverse communities, right? And so what myths do you want to bust in terms of effectiveness, productivity, competence, intelligence, all of these labels that in our society convert to, again, in quotes, success?
People will, for example, assume that people with disabilities, particularly neurological disabilities, are less capable or might need less reliable. In fact, at least in the employment context, we know that people who have disabilities are more likely to stay in a job than people without disabilities. So in terms of like making sure that someone is going to be a long-term employee, it's actually a good investment to hire people with disabilities. Another thing is that when people, hear an accommodation request, they'll sometimes think, oh gosh, this person can't do the job. But in reality, an accommodation request is really more about a tool. I need a tool in order so that I can still do my job. People who get reasonable accommodations are obviously going to be more productive, more able to do their job than people who aren't getting their accommodations that they need. People with, I'm going to say, especially people with disabilities that are more stigmatized, like intellectual disabilities, people with mental health diagnoses that are perceived as severe. People will often assume that the person who doesn't have a capacity to learn job skills or can't do the job without actually having a conversation or looking at a person's real skills and abilities. And so that's another thing I really wanted to make sure that people understand. People with intellectual disabilities, for example, can be amazing employees, especially with the supports and services that might be available in the US. Like we have, vocational rehabilitation system and home and community-based services that can provide additional supports and services on the job so that people can actually do the job that they've been hired for. So that's really another thing I wanted to make sure people realize.
Yeah, and I'll just add to what Sam is saying, that most accommodations are $500 or less for free. And also this idea of who can and cannot participate in our workforce, right, is tied to capitalism and neoliberalism, and this idea that productivity equals societal value is something we really need to start questioning. And there's a lot of, again, social norms that I think we need to start questioning because they unnecessarily bar certain people from flourishing. And so, I'm always telling people, just question the status quo. Why do you want people to return to the office? Is it because you have a lease at that office? If so, that's not a good enough reason, right? So question the status quo can help everybody feel included, and particularly people with disabilities.
They only believe in their way of doing things, just one way of doing things, just the expectations like, oh, if they don't do things my way, or I have a set vision of what a candidate should look like, if they don't fall into that, or they kind of seem awkward, I don't want to get to know that person, or I don't want to invest time in that person, right? Which I hire someone else. And I kind of been that through the employment process in the past, where I was down to the last two, and they could just went with someone else that kind of I got along better with, or something that, or they kind of consider myself overqualified, even though like but my experience is more diverse. I'm like a person who have more of like a more traditional background, where they have like spent 7 years in one industry and one job, and versus for me, I kind of have like multiple career and multiple different jobs, but also diverse skill set that I contribute. And I think they don't see that as a value, but also see that as like job hopping, or like not serious, or not passionate about it, or not committed to something. But it's kind of portraying like diverse perspective into like an organization. I think that's add values to the organization, but they don't see it that way.
I've had to deal with the imposter syndrome. I've had to deal with the sabotage. So I'm bringing that to work, unfortunately, because it's not being dealt with in the education system sometimes. And that's the intersection, because we know sometimes your race, your class, these also are having an impact and have playing their part. So how do I show up to be my whole self when my whole leadership and my middle management don't look like me and may not understand? So there's no psychological safety, whether it's the tone of my color of my skin, whether it's the hair texture, whether it's the way I dress, or the accent, the dialect, and still trying to understand who I am. So once I started to learn who I am and accepting myself, it's now going in the workplace and understanding that culture. One of the that was quite interesting, and Jennifer talked about that, some of the accommodations, we call it reasonable adjustments, and we have a funding through the government called Access to Work, where we can get those accommodations done. But sometimes people don't, it's the shame, they don't want to ask because it feels like you're not good enough again. So we're having that trauma, those triggers, that your well-being, you're not feeling like you can really say. So I've had those experiences, but I've always disclosed that I was dyslexic. And dyslexic's not just about reading and writing, and it is genetic. So my mum's dyslexic, I'm dyslexic, my daughter's dyslexic, my nephew is autistic. So I'm a very neurodiverse family. So I'm here advocating because I always want change. I always want to make something different and changing that narrative, because we cannot continue this kind of line of threads. And you have people who bully. So I've had the bullying element because they're not understanding dyslexia and they think, oh, well, you can't read and write. How can you really do your job? And it may be just a simple accommodation, which I call a reasonable adjustment, which could be just assistive technology. So I can talk into mine and having it read back, because the phonological process of how my brain is, it's just overwhelming reading a flat piece of paper. I need it more moving. Those are real basic things for me to show up, because my brain's just, as we've talked about, it's just that little bit different. And why do I have to feel discriminated by that? Because dyslexia does not discriminate. So when I was bullied, I tell you now that I felt like I was that 10-year-old child where I selectively muted and I couldn't speak. I was numb because I'm still traumatized by it, even though I've healed myself. I've done a lot of investment to work and have all of those things. But this is because of a society that's not made me feel like I belong. And not just because of my neurodiversity, but because of the color of my skin. And I don't talk about that lightly because I want to continue to talk about that in that vein. How do we work through that? How do we start that onboarding, that people feel included? We've got free accommodations. All computers has got assistive technology. Why don't we just start with that basic thing for everybody? They always say dyslexia friendly for everyone. I have one of these pens that you can write on, but doctors have them. It doesn't mean that you have to be dyslexic to have one. So it's for all. And as organisations, we need to start not having this tick box. You come in, you have to have a disability conversation, but it's a tick box. It doesn't feel real. It feels like, here we go again. I've disengaged and I'm someone who's neurodiverse or has a disability. We need to see the leadership down here. We need to see the grassroots. How much do you value your staff?
I think we need to think about designing our organizational and social cultures to be more accepting. One of the things that I think a lot about, and I included a resource on this, is using universal design, which is an architectural principle to design physical spaces to be as accessible as possible to as many people as possible. We can do that with organizational culture. We can look at our policies and practices. Benefits of that is, one, it's really good at dealing with intersectionality because your organization's already thought through what barriers are women encountering, what barriers are people with disabilities encountering, what barriers are all these people encountering. But then it also reduces the need for somebody to have to request an additional accommodation. It doesn't eradicate it, but it reduces the need. And so people are already feeling comfortable and supported.
Because we're talking about accommodations, reasonable adjustments, there's also access needs. For anyone who might be listening in who don't know what these terms mean, could you spend some time expounding on what they are and what they might look like, the different kinds of accommodations and reasonable adjustments that might exist?
I'll address this from the US perspective, and my understanding is that the UK is very similar. In the US, there is a law called the Americans with Disabilities Act, which requires that when an employee has a disability and they need a reasonable accommodation in order to do their work, the employer must provide a reasonable accommodation. And the accommodation could be a modification to a policy or procedure. So, for example, an adjusted work schedule where a person is still coming in the same number of hours, but at a different time. Changing policies about how a person works. So sometimes, for example, if an employee might have a lot of difficulty with ambient noise and might need a desk away from a noisy area of the office, might simply need instructions in writing, like all of this person's instructions are going to be in writing, or all of this person's instructions are going to be oral, depending on which is most accessible for the person. In addition, you can sometimes see, like what Marcia mentioned, provision of assistive technology or equipment that will help a person access the office. So if a person needs a a kind of software to help them do things on the computer, a special pen to help people keep notes. Sometimes, and a lot of people with neurodivergent disabilities also have physical disabilities. So, a special chair, a special desk that helps people, work without pain. Modifications, I think Jennifer mentioned this, modifications to the in-office policy so that people can work from home. Those can all be reasonable accommodations. And of course, not everything is a reasonable accommodation for every job. So if your job is to work at the convenience store, you can't work from home, right? You have to show up to operate the cash register at the convenience store. Hospital surgeon cannot work from home, at least not on the days that they're performing surgery. But a lot of jobs can be done from home, or a lot of jobs can have work from home days. I'm going to do my surgery in the hospital and I'm going to go home and put all of my notes into the computer from home. All of those can happen, and it's really about an interactive process between the employer and the employee about what will work the best. When a person has given you notice that they have a disability and the disability is affecting their work, even if they don't ask for a specific accommodation, it's on the employer to help identify an accommodation that will work. Sometimes people don't know, or the accommodations that have worked for them in the past aren't available in this office. So you have to have that interactive process to try and figure out what is going to work.
The employee research group, where they try kind of and bring in like different intersectionality and lens to the corporate company, like they're like disabled organization, like where a group where like focus on disability or intersectionality between Black, LGBTQ, and just like and a variety of different ethnicities, intersectionality as well. And that, I think that's like kind of raise awareness and trying to bring a better understanding towards like different sectionality and how it impact the workplaces. I think is another avenue of that as well. And I think like accommodations just have to be vary by different people and different needs. Like I know for HD, like sometimes we need like a body doubling, and sometimes like it's hard to kind of ask that because like it's seen as like perceived like how it's being portrayed is like it can be seen as like, oh, like I'm being babysitted or someone has to babysit us, but that's not how it actually is. Like it's actually more like a collaboration type of thing where like we probably want someone to collaborate with like someone like strength and weaknesses, like, oh, someone focus on this and we can focus on this, and we still work on the project together, as opposed to it's like seeing it as a more negative thing, like, oh, I had to watch you do this, or I had to kind of do this for you type of thing. And it's just kind of like the little things, and just like communication go a long way for this.
In the UK, we have the Equality Act, which was came about in 2010. Which before that, I remember the Disability Discrimination Act, which was which we had from 1995, and then the Equality Act in 2010, and that comes right across from the employment right into our education system, whether it's higher education, universities, colleges, and schools, which may be kindergarten and high school. So it goes right across board, and those adjustments are very similar to what you've said, but we have parts of government might get involved. So we have something called Access to Work, where you would apply for that when you start work, and then they will do an assessment and assess you to what your needs are. And I always say you have to empower yourself to know what you want, because sometimes assessors just assume sometimes that they think this is what you need. And I'm more of trying to get people to enable them to be able to empower and say, these are the things I need. It could be having somebody to be a mentor. It depends on your disability, or I'm not saying sometimes people have temporary disability. It depends on what it is. In my experience, I'm always having to tell my managers how to support me. That gets exhausting and tiring after a while, when it should be embedded. It should be part of the infrastructure of an organization, that those basic things, like even Jennifer said, that so it should be just general, like software that's free, whether it's, I'm not advertising any software, but Microsoft got a free kind of device, you can talk on it if that's what you need. There's some basic things that should be standardized across the organizations. Not I've just started the job, could I no, why should I keep doing it? So sometimes I just kind of mute out and then get myself to find a space. So that's one of the things about the adjustment, is that you have to go and ask sometimes. And I don't think that should be the way, but it is the way. You talked about the employee, those networks. I find with some of the people with the network, they get so inundated, but they're not paying people to do some of those roles. And I think we, as organizations, we need to do more investment in that. If we really want to really mean it, we need to put our money where our mouth is, and you need to invest in it fully, not somebody who's just doing it and taking it on as a part-time job with their full-time job. Dennis is kind of really touching it, crosses over some of those. Or yes, you can be neurodiverse, and you could be trans, and you can be black, but sometimes we don't cross over. It don't have to always be separate. So I'm just saying there's lots of little bits I'm saying, but the clear message for me is that the organization really needs to say, we don't always know everything. We may have to invest and bring someone in to be able to do some of this long-term unpicking. And we need to see our leaders really being involved in that. It shouldn't be alien to you, because you've got middle managers who don't know what they're doing sometimes. And then that person's not feeling safe to really show up to be themselves. And then you're doing performance management, because you haven't done all those other intricate things that makes that person feel like they belong.
One of the many reasons it's hard to ask for accommodations is because often people think accommodations is a leg up, is, something extra, and it's unnecessary. That's not true. It's leveling the playing field. And we also need to trust people's self-expertise. We know what we need. So if you have that open communication that Dennis was talking about, it needs to be a conversation. But also, like, I used to give trainings at universities about universal design classrooms and different seating options, and people would say, yeah, but then they're going to go into the workplace and expect they can sit on the floor. And I'm like, yeah, well, who cares? Right. But also, people know what type of environment they want to be in and will not be applying for jobs. Like, I'm not going to apply for a job in a factory that's super loud because I don't like that kind of noise, right? Final thing that I'll say about accommodations is that everybody needs accommodations. It's not just people with disabilities. If you're a caregiver, you might need accommodations to go pick up kids or go to doctor's appointments or whatever the case may be, right? Accommodations are not something that should be used to further stigmatize people who identify as disabled. It's something that we all as humans need.
I want to do a little bit of synthesis here, right? We established how capitalism, how productivity has been formed and by whom. And that has influenced across the board how business is done, how workplaces conduct themselves, how performance reviews are marked and evaluated, right? And something that we say with the client work and programming that we do with our clients is that once you make a commitment to do something different, everything below that starts to shift and change. This time that we are in, especially the last 3 years, heightened levels of anxiety, heightened levels of depression, because it not just has it been traumatic for folk, but it has surfaced traumas of the past and triggers of the past. And what we are currently seeing is that the topic of neurodiversity, the topic of mental health support is very, very pronounced and loud in workplaces across the board. And then I want to make the connection to something that the disability movement has always said, kind of like what some of you have always said, is that everyone steps into a form of disability at some point. And so when we create structure, when we create accessibility for all, everyone benefits. What is it going to take to shift this mindset of, I love Dennis's example that, I might need someone to work with me because I really value collaboration. I might be my best self in that moment. And what is it going to take to dispel these preconceived notions and conditioning that has been created by neurotypical folk for a select few to succeed in the world, to start shifting that? How does that happen in the workplace?
I think it happens by ensuring that we have more diversity in leadership. We need to have people with all kinds of marginalized identities leading the charge and being open about it and reducing stigma. And, unfortunately, unless it's personal, people don't seem to want to advocate in a lot of ways. And so that's why we need to make sure that we're preparing and elevating and supporting people with all kinds of marginalized identities.
I think like what the pandemic had revealed was like kind of the flaws within our system, and then kind of thinking about like what wasn't working in like in the workplace already, like kind of the 9-to-5 structure and kind of working for productivity, and kind of seeing how like everyone can be able to work in a hybrid function or even remotely is like kind of show like there's different ways of getting the job done. You don't have to kind of sit in the office, you don't commute for hours. And it started off there, and also kind of doing the inner work itself, like it's also a big factor to your inner world reflect your outer world aspect of it, and think like going to the collective healing aspect of it, but also like to be able to have this a space where like to have diverse like employees, to have like everyone speak up, like what Jennifer mentioned. A lot of people with disability are in the workplace, and they already neurodiverse in themselves, but they probably aren't speaking up. I guess as more and more people have the psychological safety to be able to speak up about it, it can help other people and bring in more diverse perspective into the company, and to drive those social changes.
So this is hundreds of years of design. So I'm just thinking, how do we begin? We've talked about investment, not just having a budget, but it's a long-term thing, and it does need to go back to the drawing board. How do we unconstruct? How do we unlearn? I'm asking questions myself as I sit here processing to really say, you know, like you said, we may not have the answers. I definitely know. I'm just one Black woman in my lived experience, and we have those intersections that may impact you, as you know. There's got to be an act of investment and a want. And who is it for? Who is this want for? It's for humans, but it's us as all. But some people may not want that to be the case. How we unpick a structure that's hundreds of years old, to really be present. And, you know, because I want it for my children, I want to be present, that they can show up and be themselves. I truly do. But there is some real topics there, which is great. We're in the juicy bits of it, but how do we start to do that?
I want to dig into, Dennis mentioned the space, of someone's capacity to have psychological safety to speak up, to ask for what they need. Marcia, you talked about how exhausting it is to constantly ask for what one needs. If we could brainstorm from onboarding, recruiting, hiring, onboarding, and then development over a year of a neurodiverse candidate who is likely not comfortable disclosing they're neurodiverse. What is that best case scenario, best practices of, we've already stated, you all have already stated that, these things have to be baked in within the organization. So can we just get really granular and specific so our listeners can, hopefully take little things away, but like right from the start of a process to a 1-year journey with a potential candidate?
I think it starts before the candidate applies. Like I said, I think organizations need to start thinking about this. And it is helpful to think through like the life cycle of an employee, right? So all the way from the application process is the job description written in a way that that is accessible and isn't exclusionary unnecessarily, right? So if it's an office job, do you really need to be able to lift 25 pounds is kind of the one that everybody quotes, right? And then, flexibility throughout everything, right? So can we make a flexible application? I've had job applications where you put in your resume, but you also do a video, which is really a really great alternative. One of the things people focus on a lot was the interview component. Can you send the questions ahead of time? Does it have to be on video? Does it have to be in person? Can it be just audio? Can it be a chat in a chat function? Can it be written? So or can it be skill based? Like come in and work with us for a day, and we'll give you some tasks, and we'll pay you. Like don't get unpaid work through your application process, please. And then, all of that, and then, kind of continue thinking through those flexible options throughout onboarding and employment policies and all of those things.
Let's move it along, right? So you covered the pre-application process, application process, interview process. Okay, now let's go to onboarding. what can organizations be thinking about through that phase, through that part of the life cycle?
Interviews are so daunting. I know from so many people I've worked with, they just don't go from the application process to the interview process. They just don't apply anymore. But the onboarding, remember, within a lot of my applications I've done, you tick whether you're neurodiverse, whether you have any disabilities. I'm not just neurodiverse, I've got another hidden disability. And you put these things down. But as I said, it's not attention to detail. So you're going there to say, I may need this chair, or I may need this or this, but you're going again, whoever's in HR or whoever, and I'm not blaming, it's a lot of things to process, but it needs to be attention to detail. You need to have those conversations. So by the time you're boarding, a lot of this thing is done. What we have with our access to work process that you can have, and I've never been comfortable with it, you can have some training for your staff, so they can be comfortable to know what neurodiversity is. But I just think that should be something that's standard in the organisation. It should be within your training, your CPD throughout the year, or your 6-month long-term training. It shouldn't be just an add-on, or when somebody comes who's neurodiverse. It's investment. You really need to put some investment and really understand the culture to make people feel that they belong. And I think I remember a lot of my onboarding, and it always just felt really clunky. Lots of bits of paper, a handbook. Who uses handbooks anymore? And that's it. And then you go and sit on your desk. I think it needs to be more collaborative, more joint up, and there needs to be ongoing training so people really understand whether it's neurodiversity, about disability, because as we know, disabilities can come at any time. Get feedback from people when they leave about what things could have been different as well, because I've left most of my jobs and I've never gave feedback because it's been so, not horrific, but there's just things that you just think, do I really want to share with them? Because are they going to really take it on board? Do they really care? Because there's no caring care. So I'll stop there, because I know I'm saying bitty things, but for me, I think there's still work to be done in organisations to really attention to detail. All the things that Jennifer said, definitely on point.
Sam and Dennis, I'd love to hear your perspectives of, now that this person's been onboarded, what can organizations do? What can direct managers do, collaborators, team members be doing to ensure that this person has an environment of psychological safety, is supported towards their own professional goals, and set up for success?
The training aspect of it, like, because a lot of it is like rooted in trauma, and a lot of it is also rooted in cultural background too. So like, if it's more like there's like a CPT or like trauma informed like training for employee staff member to be like more informed about how to handle trauma, how to handle some background and stuff like that. Is that required like all therapists go through this training, but it's kind of like it's important for an employee to go through to have how to know how to support their peer, how to support their staff member, to kind of know how to do that. Because I think like in America here, we kind of grew up like with a individualistic culture and like very much a self-care or a self-indulgent model where we have to kind of fend for ourselves and be like individualistic about like how to do things by ourselves and not ask for help often. So it's often like more very much like a self tutorial where we have to kind of figure everything out on ourselves. And I think there's not like a tutorial on like how to help other people or know how to support other people. I think that comes up in the conversation. And I think like for me, it's like when onboarding process, it's like kind of having this open communication like on once after onboarding process, where like there's a very open communication where it's very a safe space for people to kind of be open about and not be in judgment space about their background or their experiences, and just leaving there where like they know, having that space where they know they're not being judged and for what they bring to the table, or like because their differences or their disability. Like I think like for me, I was able to have like experience where I had a safe space where like just because I'd done something bad or done something, my mistake isn't being hostage at me, or like just because I say something wrong or something that it's not something like punishable, or I'm going to lose my job because I did something bad. It's just kind of being more open, having that safe space for me to kind of be learning along the way and not be punished by any means for what I share and having that used against me.
Just saying, hi, welcome to a company. here's our reasonable accommodations policy. Do you have any accommodations that we can implement to help you be successful, right? It's not always, it doesn't always have to be very complicated. Just being open about that and saying, look, we do have an accommodations policy. We have one so that if you want to, if you need an accommodation, we are willing to make it. And that can be really big.
Coming from an experience that I had with one of our clients, something that needs to be interrogated is putting people on performance plans and, behavior and consequence. Because what is currently happening is there is a set of, again, neurotypical expectations of what is considered subpar performance or underperformance. And there is no curiosity around those markers or interrogation, right? Jennifer, you said question everything. Not every organization is questioning how are these markers impeding everyone's capacity to show up as their best self, or how is this impeding specifically our current or future neurodiverse populations within our organizations. And in addition to mental health support being something that is a very strong presence within organizations for, again, everyone who needs it.
I just had some points that I had noted that hopefully it might help some people on board. I would say that an EDI team is not just one person or a person who's volunteer as a drive. We need to look at that. No strategy in place. We have sometimes organizations, they do something quick, like we had the George Floyd. Everybody wants you to talk. We want to have something in place. It's all gone quiet now. What's our long-term vision on real change? So strategies, no specific budgets assigned to things. I always find assumptions that HRs have the knowledge and skills and interests. We can't make that assumption. And that's why sometimes you have to invest in having the right expertise. You need to invest in sometimes bringing the experts in. I've got not considered as a business or a useful activity. Again, if we're thinking of long term, we really want this change. We need to invest in it. It's good for business. Policies, as Sam said, policies and procedures, not assessing routine structures to make real impact on inequality. So those are just some things that I had in my head. I think in bullet points sometimes. So I just wanted to add some of those points.
I want to leave us with this very Jennifer, all of you talked about the unlearning that's needed. And we have a comment here from one of our listeners. I can't help but think about the damage our current political environment is doing. How do we unconstruct not only 100 years of development, but start the work in the midst of our current environment that is so polarizing? With black, white, there is only one way, one right way mentality in our faces every day. And the possibility that transcends into leadership mindsets, right? And so there is a lot of work for all of us to do. This is not a time to wait for a wave to pass. This is very, very actively influencing all of our lives. And at any moment, any member of our population steps into neurodiversity. And so the stakes are very high. Jennifer, Marcia, Dennis, Sam, thank you so much for your passion. As each of you has been speaking, I've had moments of, goosebumps. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for who you are in this world, for sharing so much of your superpowers with us today. Thank you to each of you for just diving into this with me.
Thank you for having us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take good care, everyone.